When Weird West was announced in 2019, I was sold. The debut immersive sim from WolfEye Studios, founded by some of the talented folks behind Dishonored and Prey. Rafael Colantonio himself headed up the game's development. Suffice to say, this pedigree was enough to earn my hype. The game's marketing promised a true immersive sim. 5 stories, 5 characters, each with their own unique set of abilities. Players would be free to come up with creative, systems-driven solutions to their problems. Go anywhere, do anything, kill anyone. Weird West promised freedom above all else. It was ambitious to be sure, but WolfEye boasted the talent to match. So, has Weird West lived up to these expectations? Has it kept its own promises? Does it stand up to those other great immersive sims? Well, I guess you're just going to have to stick around and find out. We begin Weird West with nothing but a shovel and a revolver. The game then asks us to use these basic tools to solve complicated problems. For example, how could you take down multiple targets if you only have one bullet? In other games, you might have to scrounge for ammunition or avoid the fight entirely. And of course, you can still do that here. Or you could kick over a barrel of oil, then shoot a lantern, setting everyone ablaze. This is the kind of systems-driven solution that immersive sims encourage, yet few other games allow for. These humble beginnings are some hint of the scarcity we will face throughout the game. This scarcity drives much of Weird West's tension. With ammunition in short supply, we must be careful to make every shot count. Open combat is often a last resort. Both player and enemy alike deal massive damage with firearms. Gunfights are quick and tense like all the greatest westerns. All is quiet, then a shot breaks the silence. A sudden percussive orchestra erupts for a moment, then fades. Weird West excels in provoking these Hollywood moments. Of course, it's rare to loot more than a few rounds off enemy corpses. Players might expend more ammunition getting into a location than they find inside. This encourages stealth and a more measured approach. This is great in theory, but this game is no Dishonored. There's rarely more than one stealthy path through caves or dungeons. Verticality is limited to overworld areas like towns and farmsteads, and unless you're robbing them, it's rare to have to sneak through these locations. Hostile encounters in towns are mostly limited to bounty missions. Those rare exceptions stand out as my favorite moments in the game. At the very least, stealth does feel fair. Knockouts are highly efficient and encouraged to save resources. Yet, stealth never feels too overpowered, at least not on its own. The tight corridors of many later encounters force stealthy players to act quickly and creatively under pressure. I particularly enjoyed those moments when I found myself scrambling to hide a body before someone rounded a corner. Of course, stealth and firearms are not the only tools at our disposal. This being an immersive sim, each character can unlock their own set of powers. Initially, I expected each of them to have a completely unique set of abilities. However, only 4 out of 21 actually change with each playthrough. Now, this wouldn't be a problem if they stayed unlocked, as our passive perks do. Instead, we have to unlock each weapon ability every playthrough. Given the scarcity of Nymph Relics, our upgrade resource, this quickly becomes an exercise in frustration. Now, I can understand the intention behind this. Starting from a clean slate, the player is encouraged to try a new build every time. If Nymph Relics were plentiful, this could work. Instead, trying new abilities feels like too much of a risk. Why would I gamble on an ability I've never tried if I can just keep using the one that works? This problem is only made worse by the fact that some abilities are strictly better than others. Compare, for example, lightning rounds with Sentry Silencer. One is a temporary buff, occasionally useful against targets weak to lightning or when water is nearby. The latter is completely silent and guarantees double damage. Combine this with a perk that increases damage to unaware targets, and you can stack this to a 400% buff. You can see why I unlocked Sentry Silencer every time. Balance issues aside, most of the abilities just aren't that interesting. The character abilities in particular range from situationally useful to downright suicidal. In fact, using powers in combat is more often than not a disadvantage. Each playthrough is so short that the player doesn't have time to get comfortable with each of their abilities. Why would I try charging into an enemy when I could just shoot them from cover? You could chalk this up to my own lack of creativity, and you might be right, but compare these to powers like those in Dishonored or Prey. Those powers were often equally useful in stealth and combat. Far Reach could be used to gain higher ground or throw enemies off a cliff. Bend Time let us attach a spring razor to a crossbow bolt or sneak by a group of guards. Powers like these in Weird West don't appear until the last and shortest playthrough. The problem here is not a lack of options. It's that the game never motivates the player to use any of them. This is indicative of a larger problem with the game's design. Much was made of Weird West's intricate systems in its pre-release marketing. Did you know, for example, that you can shoot a hole in a water tower and it will only drain to that bullet hole? This is extremely cool, and an impressive technical achievement, but it adds little to the player experience. Sure, the player can use some of these systems to their advantage, but they're often inconsistent. Throwing physics objects is difficult and unpredictable due to the game's perspective. Even grenades suffer from this. More often than not, I found that trying to use environment objects to my advantage ended in my own death. It's cool that these options exist, but there's little reason to use them. It's always easier to just pull out my rifle and shoot. For an immersive sim, this is damning. Imagine if Hitman was easier to play suit only, or if Dishonored was easier without powers. Now, let's move away from combat for a bit. Weird West fancies itself something of an RPG after all, and presents a massive world for the player to explore. There are towns full of NPCs to interact with and side quests to pursue. We can pick up bounties from local sheriffs and take down entire gangs. In these aspects, Weird West is somewhat more successful. Exploration in the early game is both fun and rewarding. There are plenty of curiosities and treasures to find. The game's weird elements of horror and fantasy compel the player to dive deeper into its world. You never really know what magic or monster might be lurking around the next corner. Yet, after a while, this magic wears off. When we've encountered the same monsters 10 times in a row, they tend to lose some of their edge. Still, that initial thrill of exploring this unique world is something I'll remember for a long time. With so many locations to explore, there is of course an abundance of loot. What's more, you can even pass your collected gear on to your next character in each playthrough. You would think this might encourage treasure hunting, but for me it had the opposite effect. I only had to grind enough money for one good weapon, then pass it on to my later characters. While items persist, money does not, so I only pursued bounties and side quests when it felt necessary. Anything more felt like a waste. Another reason to do these side quests is to boost your character's reputation. Yet after 5 playthroughs, I still can't really tell if having a high reputation made any difference. Perhaps I would have noticed a change if I went around murdering folk for sport, but that's just not my style. With that said, I did enjoy the Vendetta and Friend for Life system. Sometimes I'd walk into a town and some outlaw I'd wronged would come out shooting. Sometimes I'd be stuck in a gunfight I couldn't win and an old friend would show up to save my skin. These moments were memorable, and lent the world a sense of life. Of course, we can also recruit some of these characters to our posse. I particularly enjoyed recruiting characters from prior playthroughs to help in my current struggles. Their equipment even stayed persistent across each run, which really impressed me. Now, I did find their AI in combat to be a bit lacking. Their sizable health bars and invisibility helped to hide some of this, yet my outlaw buddies set themselves on fire one too many times for my comfort. Now, I might have come across quite negative in all this, yet I want to make it clear that this game is still very fun. While I often resorted to simply sneaking around or shooting everyone, I was rarely bored when doing so. This is partially because stealth and combat are tense enough to remain exciting throughout. It's also because the game looks and sounds incredible. Weird West's art direction is superb. This world looks like a comic book in motion. Crisp black outlines highlight edges and give the impression of detail from afar. Splashes of color and light add contrast to sandy desert towns. Eerie, glowing objects mark the presence of the paranormal. The game's 2D elements look straight out of Dishonored. Deep contrast lends a somber mood and an unmistakable personality to character portraits. Every person, even the children, looks worn down and sorrowed. In cutscenes, bold splashes of color against deep blacks and browns make a powerful impression. This world is dark, and only the faintest shimmer of light remains. This is even reflected in the UI, with bright yellow and violet cast against a dark background. This level of contrast ensures that UI elements remain readable and clear against any environment. Effects and animations like the radial star wipe of the main menu add satisfying juice to even simple button presses. Yet while the art direction is superb, Weird West's visual fidelity does not always do it justice. For an Unreal Engine 4 game, some of the lighting looks quite Spartan. This is particularly true of underground areas. While I understand that total darkness would be unreadable, caves and temples look washed out. Deeper shadow with more frequent, colorful light sources might lend these areas more visual interest and an eerie mood. Compare this to a game like Ruiner and you can see what I mean. That game uses bold, colorful lighting to highlight points of interest in otherwise dark environments. Weird West could have done the same. There are some other minor issues. Character models look terrible up close, for example, but they are readable from a distance. Then again, Hades' characters are viewed from the same perspective, and they look beautiful. Character animations also lack any kind of exaggeration or appeal. They get the job done, but they aren't exactly inspiring. Still, even with these troubles in mind, the game achieves a cohesive look and feel. I particularly enjoyed little details like the furrowed map edges at the border of explorable regions. The overworld map also clearly received a great deal of attention when it could have been simple paper. These small elements of polish smooth over any cracks in the game's visual appeal. Weird West looks great, especially for such a small studio. The game's audio is worthy of equal praise. Weird West's soundtrack, composed by Matt Pearsall, is delightfully moody and unsettling. Rafael Colantonio's band Weird Wolves contributed a few original pieces as well, including the excellent opening theme, Ghost Voices. I could take or leave a few of these tracks, but for the most part, they go hard. Each is equal part unnerving and awesome. I also love the choice to portray characters' voices with unsettling mumbles. In dialogue-heavy games, I tend to prefer reading at my own pace rather than listening to voice acting. Since I can read faster than voice actors speak, the voice lines often muddy the reading experience rather than enhance it. I'm looking at you, Disco Elysium. And with this approach, WolfEye saved some budget on voice acting and made dialogue more enjoyable in the process. I understand this is a matter of preference, but it made a huge difference to me. Now, speaking of dialogue, we have one last thing left to cover. I've always felt that immersive sims don't necessarily need great stories. In a game like Hitman, for example, I tend to watch the cutscenes more as a courtesy than anything. Setting the mood and the scene is often enough, but more is always better. Weird West fancies itself more of an RPG, however, so my expectations were higher. With such a heavy emphasis on dialogue and narrative consequence, there must have been something more to this game. Weird West's narrative spans 5 player characters. Each has their own goals and ambitions, their own allies and enemies, and their own problems to solve. When I started the game, I expected these stories to weave into one another somehow. Perhaps my choices as one character might even impact another. In truth, each character's story is largely separate from the others. There is a central mystery in Weird West, but only the last character takes any steps to actually solve it. The game is more of an anthology then, and that's perfectly fine. It's just not what I was expecting, and I can't pretend I'm not disappointed. Every playthrough we have to learn to care about a new character and new problems. Sometimes this is successful, and sometimes it really isn't. I feel this would have worked far better if the player could choose which story they played first. If you're most interested in playing the werewolf, for example, you'll have to play about 15 hours until you get the chance. This game is long for an indie title. I clocked around 22 hours when I finished the story, and I was rushing by the end. Many players simply will not have the time to play every character. It would only be fair then to let them pursue only what content they're most excited about. More than that, the game does wear out its welcome around the 3rd playthrough. Perhaps it would have been best to only require 3 complete runs to finish the main story, then leave the other 2 as optional bonus runs for those still enjoying the game's core loops. As with any anthology, it was inevitable that some stories would be better than others, yet Weird West's troubles run a bit deeper. Some of these stories were clearly treated with far more care and attention. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that at least one of them feels downright unfinished. So, with that in mind, I'd like to give a few brief thoughts on each. The first journey, Bounty Hunter, was a good way to start things off. Your son dead, your husband kidnapped. The retired outlaw dusts off her old irons for one last ride. It's a tale as old as the Western itself, but some stories endure for a reason. The stakes are high, and the constant cat and mouse drives the player ever forward. In our first playthrough, the novelty of the game's weird elements are freshest too. New horrors and new discoveries wait around every corner. Pigman's story was my favorite by far, and I was expecting the opposite. I typically don't enjoy gross body horror, and I got the impression he was a violent, brutish type. Instead, I was surprised to discover that this was a heartfelt and tragic tale of self-discovery and redemption. Indeed, this was the only story in which I felt compelled to find out what happened next. Pigman Joe's side quest was a particular highlight, as was the brothel break-in. Perhaps my only problem with this playthrough was that it came too early. None of the others ever surpassed it, which further invited the sense that the game was overstaying its welcome. Protector's journey was the next most interesting, but it was already quite a step down. While I did appreciate the anti-colonial theme, I felt it could have been pushed quite a bit further. Our character doesn't even really express much anger towards colonizers until after we finish his story. This playthrough does open up a new mechanic that I found extremely enjoyable. I won't spoil it here, but suffice to say it does lean into the weird in Weird West. Now we come to the last two journeys, Werewolf and Onirist. The first of these was clearly meant to draw the player deeper into the game's setting and lore, yet it ultimately failed to hold my attention. There are high personal stakes for our character and his fellow werewolves. The Onirists threaten their very existence. Unfortunately, the game does not allow us enough time in getting to know these folks to care much about their fate. Sure, in principle, I didn't want any of these people to die. I also didn't feel enough attachment to any of them to even remember who they were by the end. At least the werewolf story had some memorable missions, which is more than I can say for the Onirist. This final story was meant as a reunion tour. We travel the West and reunite with our old characters for one last stand against the central evil. This could have been a series of personal missions with each of our characters, escalating in difficulty towards the game's climax. Instead, getting the gang back together is pretty much as simple as walking into town and talking to them. Sure, there are some minor threats we encounter, but they're no more interesting than the random ones we face along the road. This is what I mean by one of the stories feeling unfinished. I expected a brilliant crescendo, a culmination of all these stories and systems in a final stretch of difficult missions. Instead, the game just kind of fizzles out and fades. It's a damn shame. Now, a large part of the problem with these final stories ties back to something I mentioned earlier. These characters aren't connected by much until after we finish their respective stories. Even at that, the game's central mystery just isn't all that interesting. Truth be told, I didn't care much to even find out the answers. When I did, I was hardly surprised or intrigued. More than that, the game also lacks any real theme. Sure, you can point to a few here and there, anti-colonialism, the failure of the American dream, redemption, reconciliation, yet none of these is the central theme that ties everything together. If the game had instead focused on one of these and really drove the point home, the narrative would have been far more engaging for it. Pigman's journey stands out to me because it was the only one of these stories that had something real to say. His journey of self-discovery, the tragedy of his life, and the horror of who he was before becoming the Pigman were all incredibly impactful. It's hard to get across without spoiling much, but his ending felt raw and powerful in a way that none of the others did. This is, of course, a matter of personal taste and preference. You might feel entirely differently about these characters and stories. Those feelings are just as valid as my own, and if you had a different take, I'd love to hear it. For now, though, I'd like to address one last thing. That is the game's insistence on total reactivity. Is it impressive that I can kill every NPC and still complete the story? Absolutely. Yet that also means that no character can be so vital as to not be written out of it. This is a great source of my frustration with the game. I never met a character besides my own that I felt I could get truly attached to. With that, I think it's time I got to the point. Weird West is a fine immersive sim. I mean that in the sense that it is only just fine. There's a lot to love here, but Weird West's insistence on total simulation is a blessing and a curse. While it adds much to the game's quality as an immersive sim, it also results in frustrating unpredictability and shallow characterization. As an immersive sim, this game certainly stacks up in terms of reactivity. There are few games so intent on respecting and acknowledging such a broad range of player choice, yet the mechanisms by which we interact with those systems feel far less engaging than great immersive sims of the past. As an RPG, Weird West also fails to provoke any meaningful attachment to any of its characters. Moments of genuine emotional depth were the exception rather than the rule. Because of this, the player has little incentive to actually roleplay. Each story, each character is more of a fleeting curiosity at best. Yet, in spite of all these problems, I'm still here talking about it. I still couldn't stop thinking about it. Why? What did Weird West capture that a game like Deathloop could not? Well, for one, this game felt genuinely fresh. There's little else like it on the market, especially not in the realm of immersive sims. Despite my interest tapering off towards the end, those first few playthroughs were truly something special. Weird West did capture that same feeling of total freedom that I first felt playing Dishonored all those years ago. Even if it was only for a little while, that's okay. The Weird West feels like a real place, just as Dunwall felt like a real place. These worlds don't feel like they were constructed for our benefit as players. There's this wonderful feeling, this illusion that these places don't just blink out of existence when we quit the game. Surely, people still go about their business in our absence. The West was weird before we got here, and it will stay weird after we go. That is a powerful sensation, and it's key to any great immersive sim. Weird West isn't though, but that's okay. This was the first game produced by a new studio, and a relatively small one at that. The fact that it captured these feelings at all is an impressive testament to the skill and dedication of its creators. If you can look past its imperfections, you'll find glimmers of excellence. No matter what, I'm damn excited to see what WolfEye Studios do next. For now though, this is my cue for where to leave you. If you haven't played Weird West yet, maybe I've said something that excites you. If you have played it, let me know how you felt. Maybe for you it was exactly what you'd hoped for. To me at least, Weird West is a good game. Maybe even a very good game. But it's only just a fine immersive sim. Thanks for watching.